As the Smoke Long workshop wrapped up and I looked back at some of the stories that were well received and then some of the ones that, let's call them clunkers, like, hey, these are one day efforts and some of them aren't going to land. But I liked all of them, I guess, in the moment that I was writing them. So let's start there. I originate something new, and I imagine lots of people feel this way. When you write something new, it's the best thing you've ever written, and it's amazing. And then it takes a day or two for you to kind of see it in the clear without the rose-colored glasses. And yeah, it's not as good as you thought it was. What I noticed was, and I brought this to your attention, which is kind of why we're going to talk about it today, but what I noticed was the ones that garnered the most critique and had the most at risk, that needed to be changed were the ones that didn't feel good when I reread them, the ones that really weren't in my voice. And the ones that did well, where it's basically no notes or, wow, this is great. Maybe like this one thing you could tweak, but otherwise you're good. Because I did get a couple of those, which was really nice. Those really felt like my voice. So I wanted to ask you if you had a similar experience, because I was quite shocked when I stepped back and said, oh, wow, that's a really interesting correlation.
I have a different experience. I have 3 different categories that I put my stories into. Bangers, which is my own evaluation of the piece, something that I really like, I felt strongly about. And clunkers, yes, I agree. Ones that I was just like, no, absolutely not. And ones that I felt like, you know what? There's something in here. I have to get back to this. Now, I really feel like I was strongly seated in my own voice, and I know that's what we're going to be talking about today, so I can explain that a little bit more later. I felt like, okay, this is exactly the kind of thing that I like saying, and this is my voice. And I might not really appreciate the style that I wrote it in, but I really like them. The clunkers are ones that I was just like, you know what, I'm just going to throw this on the pile. And those got a little bit of feedback from some folks that were like, hey, you know what, I think you're being too hard on this. This, this seems like this. But the ones that I'm really interested in are the ones that were in between, where I was like, I think there's something here, and I think I know what I want to try and do. I have to go do it. The thing is, now I've got to do the work. Because I think last year, after I finished my first time with the March Micro Marathon, I was like, okay, well, it's time to take a rest from all of that. No. You got to get at it. You got to get right to it. So I've been actually working on the pieces that came out of that. And we just finished that up 2-3 days ago. So I'm really trying to bear down on that and get to it. So yeah, I've got 3 different categories.
No, I like that. Three categories is fine. I mean, I want to say that the whole thing about voice, none of this is like a revelation. I really don't want to come into this conversation going, oh my God, guys, we've discovered that you need a voice. We're not doing that. Okay. That's not today. I'm a little sheepish that having stepped back and taking a good critical view of my own work, I see, shoot, when I stick to my guns and say things the way I want to say them, it turns out a lot better than when I put something together in a manner that I think it ought to be. We're going to put that in quotes. It ought to be this way, right? And that might be me. I really haven't thought too closely about this, but it might be me pretending to be a different kind of writer. I find that my dialogue gets me in trouble. My dialogue isn't bad, but it isn't good. And it's because the way that I talk is not, it doesn't translate well into the characters sound stuffy and, full of themselves. I can pull it off, but my characters can't. So I don't, you know what I mean? I'm not full of myself, all the time. Intonation matters, but no, I find that when I write dialogue, it's not great, but when I write, narrative, everything that isn't dialogue, it's much better. And so my voice really hums outside of 2 characters speaking. Even to the point where when I have characters speaking in a story, very often I'll opt to kind of summarize what they say, or hint at what they say, rather than actually have you hear them speaking. And that might just be that I don't think what they're saying is terribly interesting, or you can get the gist of it and kind of move on with the lyricism. Who knows? But that's definitely a function of my voice. So I guess, Tim, if it's okay, I wanted to pick at how can we unlock our voice, recognize our voice, and really just start there. Look, I had influences way back when, and when I tried to imitate those influences, I felt good about it when I got close. And then there was a certain moment in my professional development when I said, I don't want to be them. I want to be me. So I think that's the moment that we're really talking about is, for me, that's sort of an awakening or awareness that happened many, 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 many years ago. But it's like, I don't want to imitate my heroes. I want to be my own thing.
Yeah, but that's also an extremely important part of the writing process, is to find those people that go, holy smokes, I want to do something like that artist. Like, it was Vernon Reid, the guitar player of Living Colour, that made me go, I want to play guitar. Like, I want a guitar. I want to make sounds and music like that. It was Anton Corbijn, the photographer who took pictures of U2 and Nocturne Baby's album cover. And I said, I want to take pictures like those things that you do. And I spent, a couple things. Number one, I spent about 5 to 10 to 20 to all the way up to today trying to take pictures like Anton Corbijn, like I perceived that. I have not tried to play guitar like Vernon Reid because that is hard work, and my fingers don't work like that on a guitar fretboard. So, I think it's important to read that stuff and be like, I want to be, when we were talking about doing an episode on style and voice, I started, of course, Googling like, hey, what's the difference between style and voice? The first article I got was from Reader's Digest that talked about, hey, you know what it's like. You can pick out Dave Barry whenever you read a Dave Barry article. You can say, that's Dave Barry. And that just threw me back because in high school, I completely forgot this. I loved Dave Barry, and that was my introduction to comedy writing. Now, of course, what happens now in 2026? The first thing I think of is, oh my God, please, Dave Barry, don't be some kind of like closeted racist or homophobe. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just like, right. How is that guy aged? But it's important. It's important to find those people that we admire. And I don't know. I think maybe we should lay out some ground rules, because I would say that you were copying the style of those writers, not necessarily their voice. To me, the voice is your subconscious. The voice is like your perspective that comes from all of the junk that is inside of you, all of the experiences, your religious point of view, your political point of view, your point of view on whether or not U2 really is the greatest rock band of all time, which of course it is. And I think that style is the way that you consciously make decisions to put that on paper. The way that you structure sentences, the way that you use punctuation, the way that you might put it all in one lump piece of prose, or as a script or things like that.
I like that as a distinction because it does reinforce this idea that, going way back to the time of Homer, when they're saying, recount to me the causes, O muse, of blah, 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 right? But they're calling on a divine spirit to imbue them with content, with capability. And to say that the subconscious is the root of that, I think is similar, it's secular and similar. So I like that. And then the consciousness of how am I going to craft this prose in order to express, my voice, which is more of a subconscious, thing that's emerging. No, I like that a lot.
I think voice is something that I continually dig for. Like, why, you asked a couple months ago, like, why are you doing this? What are you writing for? What's the message? And that really didn't become something I thought about until I was asked to write a little blurb about my chapbook that I was looking to get published. Why am I doing this? And so I think those investigations are the things that give us that insight into voice. And it's always changing and it's always different because we have experiences all of the time. And as writers, as creative people, we love getting those experiences and then just spitting them back up on the page, Yeah. And style is something that we choose. Like, style is a thing that what's the best way to convey this message? For you too, it's Achtung Baby. For me, it's a, 500-word piece that's a breathless sentence. Style is the way that we choose to deliver that message. Voice is always something that is changing because you should always be changing. Hopefully, I think. Guess we'd have to ask a couple of my ex-girlfriends about that one. But style is like a choice. Style is the choosing.
Yeah, I definitely see where kind of the cut and dry simplicity of that creates some challenges. So I don't want to focus too hard on the semantics of it all, but I do like it as kind of just a framework for our conversation. Because, my voice, the way I think about it anyway, is as much what I choose to say as it is how I say it. And so if you're saying style is a conscious choice and it's the how, then is voice the what? Is it the content, or is it the attitude at which you express the content, or the direction from which you come and approach the content? It doesn't seem like it's just the two things, So there's, like, we could both write a story about a serial killer, and it would sound very different, because you and I have different styles, but we also have different voices. Let's assume that we have a prompt that we have to write a story about a serial killer, and that's it. Off the cuff, neither of us has prepared for this. What type of story might that be? I think yours would definitely have a comic edge to it. Whether it was comedy or not is irrelevant. It will definitely have a comedic edge to it, whereas mine probably won't,
Yeah, I think that also is something that sort of depends on the day for me. Like, when we look at the prompts that we were given throughout the Smoke Long workshop, those kind of things, I was looking for the thing that triggered a memory for me. I think usually they come from memories. That's how I start. I am not someone that can sort of write about stuff that I haven't experienced, mainly because I am very lazy and I do not like to do research like you do. Again, I always go back to that time you wanted to write that submarine story, and I was like, I cannot do the amount of reading that you're doing.
It was fun,
but for me, it was, I'm sure it was. And that's, Bill Watterson, who created Calvin and Hobbes, always said sometimes the best way to generate new ideas is to go out and learn something. And so that's, maybe someday I'll get into that. But I think for me, for example, the first thing that I can think of when I think of serial killers is bringing it back to my hometown, the greatest city that's ever been made, Rochester, New York. We had our own serial killer, a wretched individual who was murdering folks named Arthur Shawcross. That would be my sort of starting point, and I think that is where I would sort of start to develop it. And whether or not it had that comedy element or not, I guess just depends on how it came out.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm second guessing myself now because I think I can see a way that I would do comedy to kind of kick off the event. Like, for example, if the prompt were a serial killer goes swimming, like, okay. So what does that mean?
Right.
Like, okay, so the serial killer is at the pool and watching, all the people who could be the victims, and then sort of what emerges from that. Could also be a serial killer at a lake, who's swimming around, and like, what happens? So it's really interesting to think about a literal fish out of water there, but, a person in an environment where they shouldn't be and what occurs. Yeah. And there's always this desire in me to subvert expectation, sometimes to my own detriment. Sometimes I think my stories get too complicated and they'll run off the rails because I've got this kind of intricacy in my head. And then the reader goes, what's going on here? I'm like, oh, you didn't see the lattice work of my tapestry? And they're like, no, didn't. Oh, well, let me explain it to you.
Yes. But I mean, I've done that as well, where I try to, I'm always like, let's see what I can get away with with detail wise, because I really want folks to do a little bit of the work and, to infer and to be brilliant. I just, we all want to be brilliant. And so I'll give it to a beta reader, and the beta reader's like, I don't understand what's happening here. And I was like, oh, well, they're, this couple is doing this because of this. And they're like, oh, well, I need that detail to know that. And it's like, oh, trying too hard to be too smart. But, for me, when it comes to my own voice, I think that I use comedy because I think like a lot of folks who are the funny one, I think you could, I just had a friend of mine that's like, yeah, I do improv theater because I'm a depressed male. You know what I mean? And I think that joke could kind of come a long way in describing what I do. I get afraid of dealing with real things. And if I can wrap them in comedy and then deliver that message at the end that's a little more serious, I feel like, those are my favorite things to do.
Yeah.
And that's why some of the things that I've been reading, especially when they're given to us as examples in the Smoke Long workshop, like Smoke Long Quarterly just in general is an incredible resource of fantastic writing. And I was taken aback by some of the examples that we were given by of writing. If we had a specific prompt, they would say, here are examples of people who are doing what we're asking you to try in today's prompt. And I would just be like, wow, they're just talking about murder. They're just talking about, sexual assault. They're talking about all these things. And I was like, I never thought that I could really, be so blunt, be so forward, be so visceral with these things, especially because that's not part of my experience. You don't have to pull punches. I think part of my problem in voice is that I'm afraid of like, what if I write about this? If I write about this personal experience, for example, and I've changed the names in a little bit of the situation, is there still enough for someone that I know to come along and be like, hey, isn't that about so-and-so? I just sent it to them on Instagram, and that's why they're angry at you. That's always the writer's dilemma of changing the names to protect the innocent. But, we write through our experiences, and sometimes I feel like I pull punches because I'm like, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to make anybody angry. And sometimes you can do that. You just got to know how to do it through the style, I guess, and hide them.
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure that I'm connecting with content as a limiter as far as voice goes, but I definitely see your point that if you have something to say, but you're choosing not to say it out of fear or hesitation, it will impact the quality of your voice. It's almost like when you lie. So it's kind of a form of lying, isn't it? Like I'm going to tell you, I really like your dress, and it's not good. So you can kind of tell in my voice, even though what I'm saying is one thing, the voice is kind of betraying what I'm saying. And that's how I feel when I have an inauthentic piece. That's what it feels like. It's like I'm saying something and the reader can tell it's not true. And it's frustrating. Yeah. Because I'm trying.
I mean, being authentic and not being afraid to put stuff out there is what makes some of the best art out there.
I mean, I just brought it up because I was surprised that I recognized when the voice was working and when it wasn't. But my effort was the same, and my reaction to having written was basically the same. Like, I couldn't tell that I was using my authentic voice while I was writing. And so that's where the frustration came for me, was that I only noticed it well after the fact, a day or two later. Yeah. And I'm like, well, man, I thought this was good, but like, this is not really me. And that's it. It's not that it's bad. So I'm thinking of one piece in particular where there was sort of dialogue at the end and people commented, hey, the beginning is really strong. And then it kind of peters out as it goes. And the reason that it was strong up front, no dialogue, and it was my voice. And then the second half of it was kind of playing out what the first half had set up. It was a guy sending roses to his girlfriend on Valentine's Day. And at the beginning, he was ordering it and being really excited about getting her 2 dozen instead of 1 dozen. And what does that mean? And then the second half of the story was, it playing out, them having a conversation where he realizes that she's questioning why 2 dozen? Like, what do you what's wrong? Like, what are you doing? And so that second half of the story really wasn't my voice. It was just sort of, oh, well, this has to happen. So let me I'll write it out. And it just wasn't very compelling. I think because the reader probably could anticipate how it was going to go. And so it was just sort of a long walk, to a predictable end. So yeah, I mean, and I,
hey, that's like a conversation with me.
but I take notice of that when readers say, hey, this part didn't work. I don't say, well, pearls before swine. You people don't know what you're talking about. Absolutely not. I ask them to read it on purpose. Regardless of who they are, they were gracious enough to take the time and give me a little bit of feedback. I'm going to take it seriously. And so when I stepped back and looked at it more critically the next day, I'm like, yeah, you could cut the second half of that thing right off. You don't lose anything. In fact, it's probably better if it isn't there. And then that gives you more room to do more of your voice and tell the story, in a better way. So that's right. Kind of where I am. I'm just trying to figure out, okay, earlier in my life, I did stumble on a voice, and I ended up getting published quite a few times in the 90s because I found it. And then I put it away, and I really did lose it, Tim, for like 20 years because I just was focused on career and family, etc. Now that I've come back to it, I have found it again. And it isn't me imitating Donald Bartholomew or Edgar Carrot or any of my heroes. It is me. So I'm fine with that. But it's weird that I feel like I have it even when I don't in the act of writing. And so that's what I was sort of perplexed about.
Yeah. And that's what's the, you feel it. It's just something you just have to have. You have to have a very sensitive needle to what you feel is right. I love searching for voice, and I love that I'm trying to tune into it. And I think that tuning into voice is something that is always evolving because you are hopefully getting better as a writer. And so, when you talk about having the first part of a story resonate with some of the readers, you felt good about that, right? That first half when you were writing it.
I did. And actually, right. Yeah. And the second half of it felt like a slog when I was writing it. But right. I was in it and I'm like, okay, I got to get to the end. Yeah.
Right. And I just sort of feel like you chose to have a different style in part 1 and part 2, and your voice, your voice was coming through in that first section, and dialogue is not a place where you exhibit the strongest voice. But that doesn't mean that in the future you can't find that voice in dialogue. You just don't have as much experience with it as you do with prose. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, and I don't think it's even experience. It's just a predilection. I just don't like it. I don't like listening to people talk.
Yeah.
Now, when I say that though, I watch tons of movies, tons of television. Obviously, there's enormous amounts of dialogue. I love all of that. What I'm talking about is my own personal short stories, or attempts at longer work.
Yeah.
I find that the dialogue is flat, and maybe it's because I don't have a lot of attack and defend. Maybe it's more expository. Who knows, right? But for whatever reason, I like the fluidity and the pacing of my narrative because I can get a lot done in a pretty small window. But dialogue feels like walking uphill in the mud for me, and it shows. Yeah, it really shows.
See, and from my experience in theater, I love dialogue because that's all you get when you get a script. I mean, you get a little bit of rubrics, you get a little bit of the blocking, like he takes a cup and puts it on the table. But for the most part, I love trying to give dialogue that is giving you information without being just plain bald exposition, which is the death of things. You know what I mean? I have an easier time showing my voice through the style of dialogue because I read so many scripts and I have to make it sound real as part of that job. So and prose for me is something that sort of feels like, can't we get to somebody talking? Like, I don't care what the house looks like. Where are the people? And it's also pretty funny because that was also something that I was called out for in high school in a paper, not in an analytical paper, not any creative writing, in an analytical paper. I'll never forget this. Mr. Sagan was like, and don't forget, people, when you're writing your paper, if things get a little bit too wordy, what's the best thing you can do? And he pointed at me And I had no idea what he was talking about. He was like, you put a quote in from a book like you always do. And I was like, oh yeah, I do that. So pro tip, everybody out there, if you're in college and looking to make that word count, you just do a pull quote from a book that's like 300 words long. Golden.
I'm sure they'll tell ChatGPT to do that for them when that writes that paper. Because it is 2026. It's different now.
Yes.